Hello, everyone. Yes, it works now. I greatly apologize for some technical glitches. Uh, welcome everyone to the fifth session of the UNESCO Chair Series in Comparative Education Policy. This event is co-organized by the UNESCO Chair in Comparative Education Policy and NORRAG Global Education Center. Our co-sponsors are the Global Governance Center, the International and Development Studies Program, and International Relations and Political Science Department at the Geneva Graduate Institute, as well as the KICS EMAP Hub. My name is Chanung Baek, and I am the UNESCO co-chair in Comparative Education Policy and Academic Director of NORRAG. After my very short opening, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Manuel Enrique Cardoso. The title of his lecture is How Countries and IOs Value Education Policies, Introducing the 6 E's Framework. Afterward, we will have a Q&A session. As I have said before, this is the fifth session of the UNESCO Chair Series in Comparative Education Policy. Some of you in this room, actually many of you in this room, as well as the online participants, must have attended the previous sessions. With Professor Gita Steiner-Kamsi, who is the chairholder for the UNESCO Chair in Comparative Education Policy, we have previously hosted 4 speakers from Egypt, Mongolia, Brazil, and Argentina. In addition to today's lecture, there will be an open cafe tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the cafeteria of the Geneva Graduate Institute. This is going to be an in-person event, providing an opportunity to exchange thoughts with the speaker in person in a more informal setting. And I strongly encourage all of you who are in this room to come and join us tomorrow as well. To give you a brief introduction of NORRAG, a co-organizer of the series, at NORRAG, we plan and organize our strategic activities to enable our stakeholders to first know what robust evidence exists. Second, amplify knowledge that is context relevant. Third, access underrepresented knowledge relevant to their work. And finally, act, meaning that they work with context relevant knowledge and expertise to formulate priorities and solutions. I invite you to explore our work and become part of our network if you are not already a member. Please scan this QR code shared on the screen to join our network map. I also would like to draw your attention to our The South Also Knows initiative. This initiative highlights experts from the South within our networks and promotes their work in scholarship. We aim to contribute to reversing the north to south flow of expertise and decision making. Please join our movement using this QR code on the right side. With that, now I would like to introduce Dr. Manuel Enrique Cardoso. He received his PhD in Comparative and International Education at Columbia University and EDM in International Education Policy at Harvard University. He was a learning specialist at the UN system for nearly 2 decades, first at the UNESCO Institute for Statistics in Montreal, and then at UNICEF's headquarters in New York. Previously, he worked for Uruguay's national assessment system while teaching at 2 universities. In 2023, he returned to Teachers College Columbia University, this time as faculty, from his position as coordinator of learning assessment programs at the Council of Ministers of Education Canada. Now back in his home country, he is head of research at the Institute of Education in Universidad Ort, Uruguay. His work has been published in Comparative Education Review, the International Review of Education, and Compare, among others. His research interests include international organizations, large-scale national and international assessments, their links with education policy, and languages in education. Please welcome Dr. Manuel Enrique Cardoso.
You for having me, for this warm welcome. Thank you for arranging for interpretation in Spanish, which means that my mom can listen and understand. Thank you also for arranging for this beautiful weather here in Geneva. Let me just, without further ado, start focusing on our topic of conversation today. I am what some call an academic practitioner. So I'm kind of stuck in between two worlds, right? Some may say in no man's land, right? On the one hand, I've worked at universities, up to this point, 4 different universities in 2 different countries. But I have also worked at UNESCO, at UNICEF, for the Canadian government, for the Uruguayan government. So I'm both involved on the academic side of things and on the practical side of things. And I'm hoping to, capitalize on all that in this conversation to talk about one of the most important things that I think we can talk about is how we value education and how we value the policies that make education systems work or sometimes not work so well, right? So that is in the fact that we have the word value there, right there in the title. This is going to be in many ways a moral conversation. A conversation about what really matters, with ethical aspects to it, and how, when we talk about education policy, we are discussing values, we are taking a stance for or against something, and we don't always agree on those approaches, which is why we have policy debates, right? And what we are going to be discussing today is an attempt to organize those different things that we talk about when we talk about education policy and how we value it. I'm introducing the 6 E's framework. Don't go into the world referencing the 6 E's framework as if someone is going to know what you're saying, because I'm really introducing it today, right? This is really the first time that we are talking about this. Hopefully it will become a thing, right? But we're just talking about it today for the first time. It's a byproduct of my dissertation. My dissertation was about the links between international large-scale assessments and education policies. But we're not going to talk a lot about assessment today. We're going to focus more on the policy side. And we are going to be talking about the policy that I was particularly interested in my dissertation, which was grade repetition or grade retention. So let's get started. So the outline for this talk is fairly straightforward. We're going to introduce the main 2 ideas of how to value education. Education as a human right, or education as a human capital engine, something that produces human capital, or both. Some think that we should not look at one or the other, but both. Then I'm going to introduce the 6 E's framework for evaluating policies with a case of grade repetition in mind, first of all. Then we're going to discuss a very old debate that started at least in 1975, the equity and efficiency supposed trade-off, right? And finally, we are going to discuss a couple of applications to technology, because nowadays we cannot talk about education without talking about hybrid education, without talking about computers, without talking about AI. So just to show that this framework can be versatile enough to apply to things for which it was not conceived, right? So, education. Why do we value it? There are 2 main approaches to it. Some focus on its value as a human right, and this is very old, right? It's as old as the International Declaration of Human Rights itself, which happened in December 10th, 1948, which is my birthday, by the way, but not the 1948 part, the rest of it. But since then, we've been talking about education as a human right. And as a human right, it's universal. Everybody should have the right to education. That in itself has huge implications, right? Then in the 1950s and 1960s, we started talking about human capital, right? Economists like Nobel laureate Gary Becker, for instance, started talking about how education produces capital, produces human capital, right? And therefore, we should think about education as, to some extent, along the same ways in which we think about other forms of capital. We can apply to this field the same kind of ideas that we apply to other forms of production, right? So, having a good rate of return to our investments is an important thing, right, to bear in mind from this perspective. By the way, feel free to ask clarification questions during this conversation before the actual Q&A period, and that applies also to the online audience. The clarification questions can be relayed to me. So, where do the different international actors stand on this issue, right? Who among them value education mostly as a human right? Who among them value it mostly as human capital? This small quadrant here, this small diagram shows that OECD and the World Bank focus on education as human capital. This simplifies things a little bit, but there's no question that the World Bank and OECD focus mostly on education as a human capital factory, basically. And on the other hand, we have UNESCO. And by the way, the World Bank is a bank. So it makes sense for them to look at education as an investment, right? And actually, without human capital theory, there would be no justification for the World Bank to even work in the education field, right? And the same applies, of course, to the other development banks, the regional development banks in Asia, Latin America, Africa. Same for OECD, which is not even part of the UN system or adjacent to the UN system, and also is about economics. And yet, it works in education. On the other hand, we have UNESCO. The E in UNESCO does stand for education. They were created with that mandate from the beginning, also in 1948. So they don't need human capital theory to justify their involvement in education, but they do rely on the idea that education is a human right. What about others? Well, we have, for instance, UNICEF, according to Choi, published in Comparative Education Review last year, UNICEF started looking at this perspective, at education mostly from the perspective of human capital, and around the 70s started looking also at the human rights or children's rights component of this. This started with the Declaration of Children's Rights and then the Convention of Children's Rights in the 90s, I believe. And as for UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, it kind of has its own theory about this called the human capabilities theory. And by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, that, according to Choi, combines the human capital and the human rights perspective. That is a whole debate in its own right, but we're not going to spend too much time on that now. So, obviously, if you don't value education either as a human right or as human capital, you shouldn't be in this field. And normally we don't have any organizations in that space. But as you can see, there's some variation here. And that has huge practical implications for what these organizations actually do with countries, right? Another important thing to bear in mind is this is a bank, for instance. This is a fund. The F in UNICEF stands for fund. And UNESCO is not a bank or a fund, and it has been, honestly, chronically underfunded from its inception in the 1940s. So obviously, the kind of interactions that these different organizations have with countries are different based on whether they can lend them money, whether they can just give them, grant them money, or whether their leadership is not necessarily tied to funding at all, right? So let's do a little exercise to see if we can find one practical way in which these two approaches can change the way that these organizations work with countries. I'm going to ask the people in the room, sorry to the online audience, but I'm going to ask the people in the room to answer this question. These are this slide refers to two household-based assessments of adults' literacy skills. So we literally knocked on people's doors and asked them to have an interview with us and to read for us and do math for us, etc. And there are two different programs of this kind, one by UNESCO and one by the World Bank. And by giving you just one piece of information about these two programs, I want you to guess which one is the UNESCO program and which one is the World Bank program. Okay? So one of the programs targeted adults ages 15 plus, meaning no end to this age bracket, right? The other one targeted urban adults, not rural adults, aged 15 to 64. Okay? So is UNESCO the one on the left or the one on the right? On the left? There's a lot of nodding. Yes, definitely. That is the Literacy Assessment and Monitoring Program, LAMP, implemented by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics and piloted in 10 countries and actually implemented in 5 of those 10 countries, right? And looking at this human rights approach and at this lifelong learning approach that is dear to UNESCO, there is no end to when a person can become literate, and that can make a difference in their life, in UNESCO's mind. Whereas the other program is the World Bank program. It's called STEP, Skills Measurement and Household Survey by the World Bank. It was implemented in all of these countries, but not in the entire country, but just in urban areas. And for instance, in Vietnam, for example, it was implemented in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. So not all urban areas either, right? So as you can see, this distinction about human capital and human rights is not just a philosophical or theoretical issue. It changes what these organizations do. It changes how they define the populations that they work with, right? Why do you think the bank is focused on urban adults aged 15 to 64? Well, 15 to 64 is the working age population, which is the economic term that is normally used. And it's assumed here that those skills are more important for the populations living and working in cities, particularly in big cities in those countries, right? So that is one clear example on how a human capital or human rights approach affect every single decision that these organizations make about how to do the work with countries, right? And importantly, there's another lesson in this slide. Countries can choose who to work with and therefore where to focus, right? Because for instance, Vietnam piloted LAMP, but ended up not implementing it, right? They were aware of it, they knew what it did, they knew how it worked, and they said, actually, you know what? No, I'd rather do this, right? So sometimes we think that international organizations run the show. That is not true. Based on my experience working for a developing country, Uruguay, UNESCO, UNICEF, in an industrialist country, Canada, I would say, no, that is a little bit too simple. It's a little bit more complex. There's power throughout the system. So, Joy has been looking at how countries focus, at least in their discourse, about human rights or human education, human capital, when they discuss education reforms. So let's bear in mind that this is what countries say about what they're doing. It's not necessarily what they're doing, it's the discourse. And she looked at a period between 1960 and 2018 at 170 something countries. And with a group of undergraduate students, took the time to code all of these documents to look at whether countries reported education reforms with a human rights perspective or with a human capital perspective, or both. And here you can see on the left a list of the countries reporting the highest number of education reforms with human rights discourse in 1960 to 2018. South Africa is one of them, and several countries from Latin America are also included there, including my own, Uruguay. And one may wonder why. Why there seems to be a focus on equity issues, which is one of the basic indicators of a human rights approach. Because economic inequality is a huge issue in these countries. Latin America is the most economically unequal region in the world, and South Africa is the second most economically unequal country in the world, right? So this focus on human rights and this focus on equity is related to the country's own situation, to the country's own priorities that are determined by the actual context in which they live. It's not just a philosophical choice. It's a philosophical choice that is rooted in the material reality of these countries. On the right, we see this other table where we see the highest number of education reforms with human capital discourse. And you can see that there are several Asian countries here. For instance, the Republic of Korea, Vietnam, Singapore are some of the top countries here. Is it because these countries don't care about equity? No, these countries achieved the economic development that they did, economists have realized, because they had a baseline of equity that allowed them to grow their GDPs very quickly over a certain number of years. So it's not that equity doesn't matter to these countries, it's that the priority is maybe economic growth, which they have achieved already, but they want to continue to achieve. And maybe the equity aspect is one that it's not that they think it's solved, but it's not as pressing as a reality as in, for instance, Latin America. It's still a mixed group of countries, right? This is one way to look at it. That doesn't explain the presence of all the countries in each of the lists, right? But it's just one example of how international organizations make their choice between looking at education as a human right or human capital, and so do countries to some extent, depending on a number of factors. In the case of the international organizations, it has to do with the social division of labor among them. International organizations have different mandates, so it makes sense for some of us to choose one approach over the other. In the case of countries, it's more complex. But also, what Choi finds, and what she proposes is the most interesting finding of her work, is that most countries talk about human capital and human rights. Most countries in their reforms talk about both, right? Including Uruguay and Vietnam. That we saw, well, this one does a lot of human rights references. This one focuses on human capital a lot, but they both talk about both, like the vast majority of countries. Why? Well, I think partly because education policy is the result of a process of negotiation between different actors. And we need to bring as many actors into the fold. We need to create coalitions. And for that purpose, you need to compromise and to bring together different perspectives and different values in terms of the policies that you are trying to implement. So, how can we talk about those different values? What are those different values that are at play? That's what I'm trying to introduce here to you today. So, the 6 E's framework for evaluating education policies was, in a way, a byproduct of, as I mentioned before, my doctoral dissertation. First of all, I was looking at international large-scale assessments and the relationship of them with one policy in particular, grade retention. So I'm going to be talking for the next few slides mostly about grade retention, but we will see that the framework can be applied to other policies as well. So I started looking at the literature in English mostly, but also some in Spanish and French. And I noticed that the words efficiency, effectiveness, efficiency, and equality or equity kept coming up. That those were like a refrain of the conversation about grade retention. And most scholars were actually not just talking about grade retention, but talking against it. They were criticizing it for being ineffective, inefficient, inequitable, right? So what does this mean? Does grade repetition improve student achievement? That's what determines whether we call it effective or not. What are the costs and benefits? So do the benefits outweigh the costs? That's the efficiency question. And it's a question that it's very dear to economists, as one would expect, right? Equality and equity. What characteristics are associated with being retained? Gender is one of them. And you may be surprised as to where it falls, on which side of the gender divide it falls. We will, in a minute, distinguish equality from equity. And then I started seeing other things that were repeating themselves. And the next 3 words I made up or I adapted from other uses, right? These are not necessarily the words that the authors themselves used, but I propose the term empathy to talk about the emotional effects of retention. Expulsion, to talk basically about dropout, is grade repetition associated with dropping out. And finally, evaluability. This is maybe the most complex one, the more technical one, but it's about the issue of whether it's possible to objectively evaluate the impact of retention. One might say, yes, of course it is. We can evaluate everything. Well, it's not easy. We'll see one example of why there are many. So these are the 6 E's. This intends to be a general framework, which doesn't mean an exhaustive framework. But when I looked at the scholarly debate in the US and other places, 90% of what people were saying about repetition fell under one of these. When I looked at what international large-scale assessments were saying about repetition, same thing. Most of what they were saying was related to one of these issues. So, what do we mean by effectiveness? How is the policy intervention, in this case, great repetition, associated with a later academic outcome? The simplest way to look at it, which is basically the wrong way, is to ask yourself, do repeaters do as well as non-repeaters? And sometimes say, well, if repeaters are not at the same level as non-repeaters, then great repetition was not effective. What is the problem with that? Were repeaters doing as well in the first place before repeating? No, they were not. Typically, the problem is that the earlier academic outcomes of repeaters were lower than those of the students who did not repeat. It's as simple as this. But if we look at it from a cross-sectional perspective, if we collect data one time, as we do normally in international large-scale assessments, this is all we see. We do not see this, right? And the other problem is that repetition is typically a remediation policy. It's typically a remedial policy, right? So it doesn't apply to everyone. It applies to those who need it, supposedly. It's controversial, I'll admit it, but supposedly it applies only to those who need it, okay? So even when we talk about effectiveness, there are different ways to operationalize the concept, right? Some more sophisticated than others, and some that require different designs. But the important thing is that effective is one of those magic words that can bring, the debate in a certain direction. When we say this policy is ineffective, it is important how we operationalize it, but it's important how we use it from a rhetorical perspective as well. Efficiency. Efficiency is about cost, mostly. At least in the beginning, it was mostly about cost. What were people saying about efficiency? Both the OECD and the World Bank actually introduced the idea of efficiency or inefficiency by talking about repetition. They literally said in 1967, for instance, what is internal inefficiency or efficiency? It's primarily concerned with dropout, repeats, promotion from one grade to another, transition from one level to another. So basically, repetition was a way of defining efficiency. And if your students were repeating, you were not efficient by definition, right? In 1979, Haddad from the World Bank says, wastage in the flow of a cohort of students in an educational system is expressed quantitatively in terms of dropout and repetition. And he adds, and of these two, repetition has the greater impact. He's saying that repetition is more inefficient than dropout. That it's almost preferable for students to drop out of the school system than to keep repeating, because that has a cost for the system. Whereas when students drop out, yes, there is a cost, but it's a smaller cost, right? This is almost inspired by scientific management theory. How products go on a conveyor belt, right? Remember Lucy, I Love Lucy, the famous chocolate episode, and makes us look at students as almost sitting on a conveyor belt. And if they don't move fast enough, we're not being efficient. We're not being productive, right? What's interesting about this approach, this very early approach, is that we are not even talking about benefits yet, right? Because efficiency is actually about cost effectiveness, but we're not even talking about effectiveness here. So efficiency as cost effectiveness. So we need to look at more than just the intervention and the cost. We need to look at the later academic outcome and the earlier academic outcome. That is the more modern view of the efficiency issue as cost effectiveness. And you can see that one of the problems was that we didn't have a very solid way of looking at the benefits, of measuring the benefits. Now we do. Now, standardized assessment has improved a lot, and we can do that. But once again, this may all look very objective. It looks like we're talking about relationships between variables, and that this is objectively in a certain way. But a lot of this is once again about rhetoric, how we use these terms and how we frame the conversation, right? Because when we look at the costs and the benefits, there are some very important questions. Who pays the costs? Who receives the benefits? What types of costs and benefits are we talking about? Some are financial, some are of a different kind. Some are cognitive effort, for instance. Emotional costs, right? So one of the scholars, or two of the scholars, Hong and Rodenbush, flip the script here and say, this policy, great retention, increases heterogeneity of age within classrooms, but it may also reduce heterogeneity of academic achievement within those classrooms, which may arguably make instruction more efficient. And that is something that teachers often say, and that's why some teachers are advocates of grade repetition. It makes their work more efficient. It is easier to work with a class that is homogeneous from this point of view. Aside from the specifics of this discussion, what I'm trying to say is we can look at efficiency from many different angles. And actually we do, right? Efficiency is another magic word, but we can frame it in very different ways, looking at the perspective of different actors involved in this. So the efficiency discourse can take different shapes depending on who talks about it. This is a book that I asked some of you to look at called Reducing Repetitions, Issues, and Strategies. It's actually a very small booklet that is published by UNESCO, but the International Institute for Educational Planning based in Paris, but it was actually written by someone who worked at the World Bank, right? And it's a very interesting case study of how even in the same book and talking about the same issue, what UNESCO and World Bank say has something in common, but there are also very telling differences. Françoise Cailleux from UNESCO talks about efficiency in her preface to the book and says, several economists have tried to estimate how many more pupils could be enrolled within the same budget framework were repetition to be abolished. So if we abolish repetition, we can bring more students into classrooms. But implicit is the idea we cannot use this money for anything else, right? And the idea is to make this more universal, right? So she's talking about efficiency, but she's also talking about equity. She's also talking about universalism, right? And about expanding education, right? So efficiency explicitly and implicitly equity, universal access to education.
Clarification question from the audience. What does it mean by grade repetition? I mean, do you mean that repetition earlier in the class from one grade to the next, or that students may deliberately perform more learning?
That is an excellent question. Yes, sorry. Are we talking about grade retention when a student is retained by the teacher of the school, or we're talking about grade repetition when the family or the student make the decision to do the grade one more time for other reasons? We are basically talking about grade retention. I'm using the term grade repetition here because, well, you'll see why, because I will use the term retention in a different way in a moment, right? But yeah, that's a very important distinction that practically doesn't exist in the US, but it does exist in the rest of the world. There are studies that show that, for instance, in Uganda, students repeat first grade because they are underage when they get to school, because pre-primary schools are expensive or not available. The same thing happens at the end of primary education when secondary schools are not available or expensive, etc. So that is a very important distinction. And we are actually talking mostly about grade retention. But I'm using the term grade repetition for reasons that you're about to see. Now, going back to this slide, how does the actual World Bank person, Thomas Eisenman, talk about the efficiency issue? He says, well, time series measurements and or comparators allow judgments about relative costs and thus about trade-off in public investments among subsectors or types of training. He doesn't even say education there. He says training, right? So is there an issue of equity underlying this? Maybe, but most of all, it's the idea we should move our investment in education to the subsectors where it is most efficient, right? And this notion of equity that we saw in the UNESCO approach is not necessarily there, right? And I'm talking about the same book, 6 pages apart, right? So it's an interesting case study of how two organizations collaborating on something still have their nuances about how these things work. Let's move on to the next issue. You've probably seen this meme, and the most interesting about this meme is it gets it right. This basically is the difference, at least how I'm going to define it, between equality and equity. So with the same amount of resources, the first thing basically reproduces the situations of privilege and underprivilege, right? Whereas, again, with the same 3 boxes, this creates a situation that is equitable, right? It's not equal. Not everybody gets the same amount of resources, but the result is the same, right? So that is a very simple way to distinguish equality from equity. How does this look in the context of grade repetition? Well, when we talk about equality, the question is what characteristics are associated with being retained? Some of you were talking about gender before we started. Boys are more likely to be retained in most countries. Boys are less prepared to be in a classroom because how we socialize boys makes them unruly. How we socialize girls makes them better prepared, generally, to be in a classroom, right? And socioeconomic status is another characteristic that's almost universal in terms of being associated with repetition. Now, the question then becomes, is this an issue of equality only, or is it an issue of equity, right? So when we talk about equality, we're seeing the socio-demographic variables have an impact on whether someone repeats or not, and that has an impact on the later academic outcomes, right? But when we look at it from the perspective of equity, we need to add this other point. Among comparable low achievers, retainees are more likely to be this or that. So again, we add the earlier academic outcome and the relationship both to later academic outcome and the policy intervention itself. Okay? So, am I being unfair to boys? Depends. How were boys doing before repeating? Right? Is it repetition that is inequitable, or is it the school system that is inequitable? Of course, there are many ways in which it is more inequitable, more unfair to girls than to boys. But this is one example that goes in a different direction. So this is the distinction that we want to make between equality and equity. And it's the third E that scholars used to discuss using that term, equity itself. Now, it's not just about academic outcomes in education, right? Socio-emotional outcomes are becoming increasingly important in conversations about education for a long time, but especially since the pandemic. And this issue is very similar to the effectiveness issue, right? We're talking about the policy intervention affecting the later socio-emotional outcome. But what was the earlier socio-emotional outcome of repeaters? Same question. Because sometimes the reason repetition happens is for this reason, or a combination of both, right? So what falls under this category? A meta-analysis by Holmes and Matthews talks about personal adjustment, including self-concept, social adjustment, emotional adjustment, and attitude towards school, behavior, and attendance. So as you can see, it can be very broad. I use the term empathy for many reasons. It starts with an E. And also because we need to talk a little bit more about empathy these days, now for many, many reasons. So I'm using it a little bit as a shorthand for all of the socio-emotional aspects of education. If you're interested in this, you can look, for instance, at some of the work I did while I was at UNICEF. The program LSCE stands for Life Skills and Citizenship Education. That happened in the Middle East, and SEAPLM, Southeast Asia, Primary Learning Metrics, that obviously happened in Southeast Asia, and looked at mathematics, reading and writing, but also global citizenship, where we specifically talked about empathy as a construct, not as in the general way that I'm talking about it here. So empathy, expulsion, is basically just another name for dropout, but I say expulsion because we sometimes blame the victim in these situations. And I'm certainly not blaming teachers, no? But systems, we may need to look at systems, at what systems do to retain students. That's why I wasn't using the term grade retention, to retain students rather than push them out. I'm not talking about expulsion when someone is expelled from a school. I'm talking about, the inability of the system to retain students, to keep them engaged. And again, the policy is associated with dropout, but does it cause the dropout? It can be a little bit more complex than that, because we know that all of these things were happening before the policy intervention. So it may be that there's a path to dropout that goes through academic outcomes. It may be that there's a path to dropout that goes to socio-emotional outcomes. And it may just be that there's an efficiency issue. If you need to stay one more year in school, all the things that are pulling you out of school become stronger when you turn 18 and you're still in 9th grade, for instance, right? So some of those are the reasons why there are relationships, at least associations, if not causes, that link repetition and dropout. And finally, the question of evaluability. how do we typically evaluate a policy or a program or a practice? We try this on this group and try it on this group and see what the difference is. That is something that comes from even clinical trials, right? That has been exported to education. It is impossible to evaluate repetition in that way. There's a number of reasons why that wouldn't work. I'm not going to there's a whole article and a whole conversations about this point, but what I will say basically is, we've already mentioned, it's a remedial policy. So it will only apply to some students in each classroom, right? Then after the policy is applied, what do we do? What do I compare these students to, or who do we compare these students to? Their classmates or their former classmates? This may seem like a trivial question, and yet it's not trivial. The results are completely different. PISA, the OECD study, does it one way. ERCE, UNESCO study in Latin America, does it a different way. And voila, completely different results about the gap in achievement between repeaters and non-repeaters. So is it possible to objectively evaluate repetition? It's very difficult. And this results in one of the more technocratic critiques of great repetition. We don't like it because we don't know what kind of impact it has, because the usual evaluation tools that we apply to all the policies do not work on it. And therefore, in addition to all the other reasons not to like repetition, there's a group of people who generally evaluate policies that do not like it for this reason, right? So it may seem technical and odd, but it's very important. So I want to now focus on two of those values that are related to the human capital and human rights approach. First of all, let me take one step back. Are there any questions, clarification questions about the 6 E's? I mean, in terms of the discussion, we can go back to this at the end of the session, but at least the 6 concepts are more or less clear. So let's move on then to the next topic, which is the equality and efficiency trade-off. Arthur Okun in 1975 wrote that book over there, which made waves, and which created this notion that if you're a country trying to develop, and this was done more from a domestic perspective in the US, but it affects it ended up affecting everything, everywhere. You have to choose between being an efficient system or an equitable system. If you try to be equitable, you don't create incentives for people to get ahead economically. That is part of what he was saying. There's been a whole debate among economists about this since then, right? And more recently, the World Bank precisely has argued that Okun was wrong, that actually for sustained growth over a decade, equity is good. That if you want countries to grow in a sustained manner, equity is a good thing, which kind of explains something we said a little bit earlier about some Asian economies doing well after starting with a baseline of equity, right? Or relative equity. And what's interesting is that Okun is not talking specifically about education in his book, but when he does talk about education, he says education may be the exception to this trade-off. He says equalizing financing opportunities for higher education is one of the ways by which the nation can obtain more efficiency and more equality. He's talking about higher education because it was the big divide in terms of education in the US, right, in the 1970s, and it continues to be nowadays in the US. But we could be talking about secondary education in many other countries, for instance. And he says, you don't have to sacrifice one for the other, right? So is there a trade-off here? We don't really know. Even the person who came up with the idea or who gave it the name and the impact that it has says maybe education is different in that regard. Maybe if we manage to distribute opportunities in such a way that those with the most talent are the ones who get ahead, this is both efficient and equitable, regardless of their social and economic background. So let me very quickly finish this with a couple more examples and the final remarks. AI is one topic that we're all talking about and its impact on education. This is just to show you how the conversation about the 6 E's is pretty much everywhere in one way or another. This is a group of people working for TIMSS. TIMSS is the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study that IEA implements. And they're talking about introducing automated scoring for TIMSS, right? And using AI for it, using machine learning for it. And they use 2 arguments. One from the beginning, automated scoring holds promise as an efficient method for generating additional scores for all students' responses, etc., while costing less and running faster. So this is very clearly the efficiency argument. This is efficient. It's easy to associate automation with efficiency, right? But towards the end of the article, they also say there is potential for bias in human scoring due to misspelling that are treated differently from scorer to scorer. Therefore, automated scoring should focus on consistent and accurate assessment within and across countries rather than simply emulating human scoring. What they are saying here is this could be more equitable than human scoring, more fair, more just than human scoring, right? In our imaginary, when we think of automation, yes, it may be more efficient. That's the first thing probably we think about. We can, to some extent, buy the argument that it could be more equitable, right? Which of the E's is missing clearly from this idea of automation? Anna? Empathy. So they're not talking about empathy, but we could be, right? So whenever something new, appears, we may think we're not prepared. Well, we have been talking about the underlying issues for a long time. This is partly a discussion about efficiency plus equity versus empathy, etc. Right? Finally, my last example is from Uruguay. Uruguay was the first country in the world to implement the one laptop per child approach on a nationwide basis. This is something I'm only starting to work on, right? It's not a meta-analysis. There are only 6 articles there, but I'm trying to show 2 things. One, you can use the 6 E's and eventually add more E's as you need them to discuss, what impact a policy may have had in a country, for instance, right? But also, a very important thing is, what was a policy supposed to do in the first place? Sometimes we think we have clarity about the outcome of interest in a policy, but sometimes it turns out that people were expecting different things from a policy. And I'm not talking about the E's, I'm talking about the actual outcomes. very, very quickly. There's almost a consensus in Uruguay that access to technology improved as the result of this program, right? All primary school students have a laptop. Public primary schools, right, have a laptop. They are connected to the internet. Uruguay is a very small country, very homogeneous, and without much geographic accidents that would prevent this. 90-something% of the people live in urban areas, so it's very easy to do this. But people expected this to have an effect on learning. It hasn't had an effect on learning. It was not stated as one of the outcomes of interest when the policy was introduced. But people were saying, well, what do they have these for if they're not learning more? So something was explicit and other things were implicit, but there was clearly an expectation. So a lot of the debate has to do with this side, but a lot of it also has to do with this side. What is it that we actually expect from a policy? And it's not just what we state, it's also what we imply or what we expect. So I'm not going to go into details here, but as you can see, almost all of the E's are represented here in at least 3 different types of outcomes that have to do with learning, access to technology, and other outcomes like attainment or the study field. There was maybe the expectation, and this was actually one of the stated outcomes, that more students would go into STEM fields. One study found that fewer students are going into STEM fields. I'm not saying this as an indictment of the program or anything like that. I'm saying there are many different ways to think about the success of a policy, and some of them are implicit until after this policy shows results. And then the debate becomes a different debate, right? So, some concluding remarks. In considering education policy alternatives, different actors, domestic and external actors, assigned different value to different values. This is a little bit of a play on words, obviously, but it's hopefully a meaningful one, right? We assign worth to effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and there are tensions between those. How do we reconcile those tensions? And how we use our rhetorical devices to bring a coalition together that can be satisfied because we're looking at several different aspects of this simultaneously. Some international organizations see education as a human right, prioritizing equity, others as human capital, emphasizing efficiency, others combine them. But countries can choose to some degree the external actors with whom they collaborate or they partner, thus emphasizing different values and outcomes. Countries are not at the mercy of international organizations. And having worked for 2 of them, I can tell you that from firsthand experience, and that is a good thing. The 6 E's aim to provide a general, but clearly not exhaustive, framework to examine those implicit or sometimes explicit values. In policy debates, actors can move the goalpost. So we were talking about access to technology, but we thought this was going to bring learning, right? Well, that is what I mean by moving the goalpost. By focusing on outcomes other than the ones explicitly or implicitly intended. And finally, a question or 2, how to resolve tensions between values. And if policies combine a wide range of values, can they find support among wider coalitions? Is it one way to bring more support for a given policy by checking all the boxes on the framework? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for your engaging presentation and also for sharing this very interesting 6E framework. I'm pretty sure I can tell that people in the room will start referring to that framework in future conversations. Now I would like to open the floor for the Q&A. Just for those of you who are joining us online, we have a person in the room who's following the Q&A box very closely, and she will share the question to the speaker, and the speaker will also address them. So please actively share those questions in the online Q&A box as well. Let me first get some questions from the audience. Let's get 2 or 3, and then you answer them, and then take another round of questions. Any questions, comments, reactions?
I also have feedback. I mentioned that it was a good thing that my mother could have access to it. She just sent me a WhatsApp message saying, I don't understand anything.
But not because of the interpretation.
It's not because of the
Yes. Ulvi?
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the differentiation between valuing a policy and evaluating a policy.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Let's first, Manuel, if you don't mind, let's,
Right,
yes. Any other questions?
Yeah, it's on Okun, the trade-off. I mean, I know that it's a very old book and also I haven't read it. Maybe I can find this particular answer if I read it. But it's interesting for me. So when you say about the equality and efficiency, and then he was considering socioeconomic as how you could, that's the only way you could integrate or sort of bridge the gap of the trade-off. Are there any other criteria that he considered? Because if that's the only criteria, then I don't know if that would actually work.
Yes, I see.
Are there any others that he considered that you know?
I understand the question, yes.
Yes.
I will.
Raquel?
I was just wondering, where do you see the most kind of applicability of the 6 E's? Is it more in academia or also practical IOs, government? So I'm just curious in your perspective on the applicability of the 6 E's, which is a very interesting one.
Let's just get one more, and this time from the online participant, if there is any.
So there's 2 that have been assessed. It's from, I took from the...
Let's just share with, it's just one this time.
So I took from the Turkish Education Foundation. They're wondering, how do you approach the idea that education is considered as a panacea for solving structural inequalities?
A simple question.
So let's first address those questions. And if you don't mind, for those people who are joining us online, they were not able to hear the questions shared in the room. So if you can repeat them, that would be lovely.
Can you remind me your question briefly?
Differentiation between valuing and evaluating.
Oh, yeah. So we've been talking about policy evaluation for a very long time. There's a relatively emerging field called the sociology of valuation. It is mostly French, and it looks at it. I mean, the idea of evaluation has this sort of objective aura to it, right? If we evaluate a policy, we will know if it actually worked or not, and we will have proof, evidence that it worked. The valuation is more about how does the public feel about a policy, for instance, right? And what are the moral values that are involved in our perception of a policy? The Plan Ceibal policy in Uruguay, for instance, is extremely popular. People don't necessarily care or even know whether the learning achievement has been affected by this. They think it's a good thing, right? So that is part of the difference between the sociology of valuation and what we know as policy evaluation. But it's a good question, and it's an open question because this new field is an emergent one. The second question was about Okun and whether he was focused more on the economic aspects. Yes, because he was an economist. But I'm a sociologist, and Bourdieu, for instance, and many other sociologists have been talking about different forms of capital, right? Not just economic capital, but social capital and cultural capital. So if you're interested in that, Bourdieu is a good source for capital, cultural capital, and Coleman, for instance, is a good source for social capital. And there are others. But yeah, I agree with you. It's not just about the economic inequalities. UNICEF, for instance, commissioned a study to FHI 360 about how education inequalities between different groups were associated with violent conflict, right? And they found that things like the genocide in Rwanda or many other similar situations may have been related to education inequalities between different groups, sometimes gender, sometimes ethnic differences, religious differences, and so on. So there are many ways, not just the economic way, in which we can look at the equity aspect and different divides, different types of divides. The third question was about applicability of this. We often say that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? That is what's happening to me since I came up with this. Wherever I look, I see the 6 E's, right? In my academic work, in my applied work, and so far, I don't have a problem with that. I'm having more and more examples of the applicability of this. I'm starting to wonder, for instance, and I'm not in the health field, but I'm starting to wonder if in the health field there might be occasions for applying this. It doesn't mean that it would apply in the same way. For instance, language policy. I wouldn't talk about expulsion so much, or I would still talk about expulsion, but I would also talk about exclusion, or in terms of gender. In Afghanistan, women are not allowed to even enroll in secondary education. That's not expulsion, that is exclusion from the beginning. No, we are talking about these people are not even allowed into the system, not just pushed out of the system. But yes, I've been seeing it in my academic work. I've been seeing it in the more applied work that I do on technological innovations in higher education, for instance, which is one of the things I'm working on now, which has nothing to do with this, but you can also think about it in those terms. And I would encourage you to try and start thinking about this in these terms to see if you can find applications. And the question online was about the role of education in structural inequalities and inequities. That is that is the trillion-dollar question. We sometimes, I feel, blame education for not being able to solve those structural inequalities as a way of saying we don't need to introduce other changes, right? That is very much my own view, my personal view, not representing any of the organizations I've ever been part of. But yeah, I think it's a good question. Sometimes we say, well, you don't have what you deserve, but or you don't have what you want because you haven't done the work. You haven't studied, you haven't worked. If you did, you'd get what you deserve. Or that same thing applied at the country level, right? I think it's ignoring the fact that education has a certain range of action that it can affect, and there's things that fall beyond that scope, that maybe other types of reforms are also needed. That is a minefield, really.
Thank you. Let's get another round of questions. And it doesn't have to be a question either. Any comments, reflections, thoughts? Yes?
Question about policy. I was wondering about how do you balance equity and equity in education? For example, as a for example, let's say we have a specific deadline and everyone has to follow the deadline, that's equality. But at the same time, if you try to be equitable, like maybe one person or that person has to do as a family, maybe cannot do assignments or maybe cannot access to the school in the first place. But then if you try to be equitable, then the rates of being equal or not equal to other peers. So I was thinking, how can you balance being equitable and equal, and also how does policy intervene to the conditions?
I think it depends on how you frame it.
Manuel, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Let's just because we also need to repeat the question from the audience. Yes, Marina.
I have two questions, but the first one is very short. I saw in your analysis of the specific policy in your right, you had a 7 feet, which was externality.
Yes.
You could
Yeah.
a little bit. And then my other question is whether you have explored these also in the different languages and values oriented in public and private actors. I think you're exploring how different international organizations work, including those values and meaning different things with similar words, similar terms. But I wonder how that also might apply, and if you had any research on that, any thought on that, how that applies also to that even more the distance universe of public and private actors in their engagements in education, what they mean.
And perhaps we can end this round with my reflection.
Okay.
Just a quick note. Was there a question from the online?
There are a lot.
Oh, a lot. Then let me save mine and then let's go to the online question.
So I think this is the key. I was asking if you could once again explain the link between the value lenses of the human rights versus the human capital and applying that to the 6E framework that you have introduced.
I can start with that.
Yeah.
When Choi did her analysis.
Manuel, I'm so sorry. Could you start
repeat the question? What is the connection between this idea of human capital and human right and the 6Es framework? Well, the most obvious connection is when Choi does her analysis of what countries look at human rights or human capital in their reforms, she actually uses the words equality and equity as part of what constitutes a human rights approach for her. She does not use the word efficiency to look at human capital, but I'm happy to argue that efficiency is part of the human capital, approach to education. So maybe the most obvious one is the identification between human capital and equality and equity, and universalism. It's not an E, but it's associated with this idea, and efficiency and the human capital approach. The question about the 7th E, externalities. Externalities are benefits that are received by not the intended beneficiaries of the program. The intended beneficiaries of most of these programs are children, students themselves, right? But in the case of Ceibal, there were effects on the children's families. They were not necessarily the intended beneficiaries, so you can think about it as an externality, as a positive effect that went beyond the target population originally defined. There can also be negative externalities, for instance, on the environment, the use of artificial intelligence, for instance. So that's what externalities means. Your other question was? It's a good question. I'm working at a private university now, and I find that equity, for instance, is a very important value for that private university, right? So I don't think it's a completely different set of values that applies. There may be nuances, but it's a good question. I would have to, what I'm working on for that university, I think that a lot of this framework actually does apply to them. But it's a good question. There was a question about equality and equity, and I would add that sometimes that difference also has to do with empathy. acknowledging that there are differences in the beginning that may have to do with different aspects, right? And that's why when we talked about automation, we're saying it lacks empathy, right? I'm doing everything equally, but not necessarily equitably. Forms of automation based on artificial intelligence, for instance, are much more sophisticated. So they may be able to be at the same time standardized and more tailored, more customized, while being to some extent standardized. You see what I mean? But it's a good question. And in all of these decisions about looking at equality or equity are questions of moral values, like I said before, right? Even looking at efficiency from the UNESCO perspective or from the World Bank perspective in one of the examples that we discussed, it's not just choosing one E over the others. You need to pretty much address all of them in one way or another, but it's also how you frame that particular E in the discussion, right? If it's efficiency that lets you invest more in education, or it's efficiency that lets you invest more in giving a tax cut to some people, or et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more round, like quick round. Actually, let's start with the online question.
So there's a question of if you perceive a change in the education policies of countries given the effects of the terrorists on countries around the world. And I am personally interested to ask on top of that how you see what we can move forward with the current economic policies that is happening around.
Okay, let's get one more question.
Yeah.
Any questions / comment? Any? Yes, then please go ahead.
I think that issue is very much in flux. I don't know if you saw the news today. It looks like...
Could you also repeat?
Yes, sorry. The question was about tariffs and how that could upend the trade landscape. Well, it looks like there's been a reversal to some, or maybe some things were put on hold. So I'm not going to talk about that based on that excuse right now. But yeah, I mean, obviously, a huge part of this conversation has to do with the economics aspect of education, right? And the efficiency that we've been talking about sort of represents that whole dimension, right? So inevitably, any change to policies and any changes to the aid landscape will affect the conversation on education policy, right? Who gives how much to whom for what? Is aid earmarked for specific purposes, or is it given unconditionally? Which countries play a bigger role in giving? Obviously, the US was a huge donor. It looks like it might become less so. Will anybody else step in to fill that void? Those are very much open questions right now, but obviously they affect this entire conversation.
So once again, Manuel, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone online and in person who shared amazing questions, and thanks for your participation as well. And with all of that, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Manuel, for your talk. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. And thank you, the NORRAG team, for your wonderful support for the organization in general. Please give a big round of applause.